Hello, folks. This is Founder Laren with the Fantasy Grounds Academy. I'm going to go over some best practices and tips for Fantasy Grounds. Some of these may apply to you, some not. Some of you have different levels of experience, so I'm going to assume that a lot of you are either newer or have been played in a long time. If this is not the case, I apologize in advance for some of the more redundant things, but nonetheless, let's get started. So this is the launcher. Just so you have a good idea of what's happening, it's important to have your account set up. So once you install the application, make sure that some sort of pop-up comes up that allows you to include Fantasy Grounds as an exception for either your antivirus or your firewall. Sometimes that thing won't pop up, and it can cause problems down the road, meaning that when you have other people connecting to you, that might get blocked. And that it's also the case for players. If you have a blocked or partially blocked connection, you might have that issue where you might be able to connect to the game, but you can't control your characters, so on and so forth. So that's kind of a common thing that happens with networking and such. Now, the next thing is in your settings. If you go into the Fantasy Grounds settings, make sure if you have a license key, you put that in there. It's not required to have a license to play Fantasy Grounds. You can get away with just the demo, but you have to connect to a host that has the content. So if you want to build characters, that sort of thing, they either have to invite you and allow you to connect to their table, or they can leave their table up and send you a message and say, hey, I'm going to leave my table up for a while and you can work on characters. Without any license or content, it's kind of hard to practice using Fantasy Grounds. So at the least, you'll probably need a core rule book and the base account. Nowadays, it's $50 all across. There's no more tiers. It's either you have Fantasy Grounds or you don't. They don't have those ultimate and the standard license anymore. It's all just one $50 license. So they simplified that. Application scale. So this is to change how Fantasy Grounds appears in your window. So if you have a really large screen, you could probably get away with adjusting this more. But the more you expand it or make it larger, it will allow you to read the text better, but you start running out of room because of the size of the graphics. So you have to pick a happy medium. I have it on 102 only because I'm doing a stream and I want you guys to be able to see some of the text. However, if you were going to run a game or something, you wouldn't necessarily have to run it that way. Some of us need glasses. Some of us have really small laptop screens. So that isn't really the best experience, I don't think, unless you're a player. And then even then, you'll be kind of squeezed out for room. One of the things that has always kind of been a part of Fantasy Grounds, and it's not necessarily positive, but the text or the font sizes cannot really be adjusted too much. And the only way you can really do that is through this application scale. And you can get extensions that do increase some of the fonts, but there is a character field limitation. So you can't change the color, you can't change the scale of the font very easily. So that's something that's kind of always been there. I hope they can change that in the future, but that's been going on since Classic. So I'm not sure what's really the issue with that. But I was told you'd have to rebuild the whole thing, so we'll see. But nonetheless, here's where you change the scale of the application globally. So if you need to turn it down or up, you pick what you need for your sessions. For players, this is individual. So if you change this, it doesn't change the player. So if you're going to be running a game and your players having problems seeing, have them change the application scale. You can also do it in Fantasy Grounds, but it's better to do it here, because this will change it globally instead of per session. So it's kind of up to you. You put your username, password for the website. You do have to have an account for the Fantasy Grounds platform. So if you're going to play or run games, even if you're not buying anything, you still need an account. I'm not sure why you have to as a player, as just a demo user, but that's just how it's set up. If you have content on Steam, or if you have like Pathfinder or Starfinder stuff, you'll want to link your Steam account and your Paizo accounts to the Fantasy Grounds store. And that'll be helpful if you are going to purchase content outside of the regular Fantasy Grounds store. So for Steam, in most cases, unless you have gift card or free credits, I would use the store, the actual Fantasy Grounds store, if you're in the United States. If you're outside of the United States and you want more localized pricing, most cases it's favorable if you use Steam. So if you live in Brazil or somewhere in Europe or something, it might be more beneficial to have a Steam account instead of a direct store account, depending on where you live. For Paizo, they have a partnership. So if you own any digital products on the Paizo store and you connect it with your Fantasy Grounds account, you'll get a slight discount, or you'll get the difference in the cost of the PDF. So for example, if you buy a Fantasy Grounds version of a Paizo module and you have your accounts linked, if it's one of the supported items, you'll get the full thing. Maybe you'll spend, let's say, $50 on the core rulebook. You'll get the PDF automatically. If you sync your account, you'll get it and you can download it. Vice versa, if you already have the PDFs but you don't have the Fantasy Grounds versions, when you link that and you go to the store to buy it, it will show you your discount. There's a link for it on the store, and you'll get the difference between the PDF costs and the Fantasy Grounds version. So if you buy it direct from Fantasy Grounds and you don't own either, you're paying the full price of both Fantasy Grounds and the PDF. If you already have the PDFs, then you're only going to pay for the Fantasy Grounds portion of it, depending on the discount and what the product is. There's a few out there that may not carry over. I don't know exactly what they are, but that's one of the things. For the data directory, I wouldn't mess with that too much unless you're really sure what you're doing. Sometimes that interferes with updates and where you store your content. The data directory is something that people like to change to save room, or maybe they have a storage drive, that sort of thing. You'll just have to remember that when you go to update or move things around. I don't know if I would move the app directory, but the data directory where you store all your additional content, you might be able to change that, but I wouldn't mess with it too much if you can help it. Some people need to because they have limited storage. It doesn't work well with online storage, so I wouldn't point it to a cloud or something like that because it's live and it has to read and write that data all the time. So I don't think that's a good thing. If you're going to back up Fantasy Grounds, which is recommended, you want to back up the whole data folder, or at least your campaigns, your extensions, your images, those sort of things. And then if you have to reinstall Fantasy Grounds or move it to another computer, once you install it, you can copy and paste your data from your older Fantasy Grounds. That's the best way to do it. And they prefer that you use either a thumb drive or a secondary hard drive, or something a little bit more stable than a backup account. You can use an online storage, but you don't want to use it live. So you don't want it reading and writing while you're playing, essentially. And then there's a support tab. So if you ever get problems with Fantasy Grounds, you can gather your logs. Sometimes you'll have to force an update. Once in a while, the updates will get corrupted depending on your settings on your computer, networking, all that sort of thing. If you need to start all over, you can clear settings. You can do show setup, and clear vault is essentially deleting all of the downloaded content temporarily and then re-updating. And what that does is sometimes you'll get a corrupt file. You can either delete the file if you know what it is. If you don't know, you'll have to clear it. Unfortunately, it'll take a long time to update it again because you've basically wiped out all of your content. That I would save for kind of a last resort. So if you get a lot of corruption in that drive, or when you were downloading or updating, then that might be a helpful tool. So once you're done with all your settings, then you want to go ahead and hit save. Once in a while, you'll have to update. There usually is an indicator that you have official content to update, but if you subscribe to anything on the Fantasy Grounds Forge or the community content, you'll have to manually update. So if you suspect that there's updates, or you just do it once a week or whatever, you can click the update button and it will check. You're basically telling it to update instead of waiting for it to tell you that. and it's not going to indicate that you have an update on the Fantasy Grounds Forge. So official content that comes directly from the store, that will show an indicator in most cases. But if you have Forge subscriptions for, third-party content, it's not going to let you know that. You have to do it manually. And every once in a while, when there is an update, you'll also notice that your Forge subscription content will update alongside it if there is anything. So there's no indicator on that other than going to each individual page and seeing if anything's changed there before you hit the update button. So here I'm noticing there's something going on here. I guess there's some sort of update. I'm not sure what that even is. I don't know what that is, but nonetheless, these are your updates. Not recommended to do those right before a game if you can help it, and those are usually Tuesday and Wednesday during the week. Depends on what the updates are. Usually the incremental ones are weekly. The third-party Forge stuff can be any day. It doesn't matter. And then when they do a major release, there's only like 1 or 2 a month, and those are usually after the incremental updates. And the incremental updates are just like errata, missing images, smaller things. The larger ones are when you start changing the version of Fantasy Grounds and when they add new features and that sort of thing. And if you're going to be someone who uses a lot of extensions, you may have to suspect or expect that there's going to be breakage. That's just the nature of it. So if you have a lot of extensions or even a few, it can break from version to version. So that's something you'll have to deal with. And I mean, I try not to use them if I can. There are a lot of really cool things. They make Fantasy Grounds a lot more accessible and easier to use, but they also run into problems depending on how complicated they are, depending on what they do. So if you're going to be starting out with Fantasy Grounds, I wouldn't use a ton of extensions. I would just slowly introduce them. Same thing with content. You don't need 50 million tokens, 20,000 books. Those sort of things should be probably better solved as, doing it incrementally. Of course, there are options out there where you can buy an entire bundle, like you can buy the whole rule set or something like that. Probably okay, but you don't want to load all those if you can help it. I mean, if you're by yourself, you don't have anyone connected, go ahead and load those all up and check them out. But when you're actually playing and you got people connected, you probably don't need every single thing loaded. I mean, it's not bad or anything. It's just not recommended because you can introduce lag, memory issues, and have a bunch of excess content that's not going to be used. So it's kind of up to you. Let's see. So once you have Fantasy Grounds updated, you have it figured out to where, where everything's set up. On this front launcher, you have the user manual, which is kind of a basic thing. It's more or less their Atlassian wiki guide. There's some tutorials. There is forums for official reporting. So if you have issues, you want to try to report those there. I see a lot of people going to places like Reddit, YouTube, or places like that. I think that's okay, but it's better if you do it on the forums and you give them a copy of your log if necessary. And you can ask questions. There's more eyes on it. There's more people. There are people who will post in Discord, they post in Reddit, they'll post on the forums, and that's kind of confusing for the moderators and the people who are trying to help because it's repeated 3 or 4 times. It's not necessary to do that. I've done it in the past. They've asked me, hey, don't post it in 6 areas because it's really difficult to differentiate which ones are which and which ones have been handled, and a lot of the same people are looking at those, and it's better if you just report it in one place. So usually the official Discord or the forums. Those are your 2 best bets for issues, account things, those sorts of things. I see people ranting on X or they're ranting on Reddit or whatever, and those tend not get as much response. And if you do get responses there, more than likely it's not necessarily the official support. So you're just going to get people's opinions, such as mine, and they may be helpful, maybe not. All right, so when you want to start a new campaign, there's a couple things you want to consider up front. And I think a lot of us don't realize this until we start using Fantasy Grounds for a while. So if you're someone who likes to make a lot of content, over time, you're going to realize that you're sort of kind of stuck. Like if you have, let's say, a new campaign you've been playing for a while, and you start building like tables and your own monsters, and then you go, hey, I want to use these in another game. It's kind of hard to do that in one campaign. So the best practices for that, for content creation, is to actually create a kind of a work campaign or a workspace. So if you're, instead of creating a game and playing it, inviting people in there, you make a separate one and you do all your work in there. And when you're done with your work, you can export the module. That way it has a little bit more flexibility as to where you can use it. You can use it in other games. You could share it with your friends, that sort of thing. But when everything's in one campaign, there's a couple things that at risk there. One is you're kind of painted into a corner essentially until you can export the content. And the other is that since your campaign is evolving so much, there is a chance that you may change or undo something. And then also there is also that, it's not flexible to where you can use that same stuff in other campaigns. So if you're going to create content, it's better to start a work campaign in the beginning of your Fantasy Grounds career. That way, when you have content you want to make for a specific rule set, let's say you have some Pathfinder stuff, you have a folder, you have a workspace or a session or a campaign that you use to work through everything. And that one you can have all your content loaded, and that way you have access to it. But generally speaking, you want to use a separate campaign when you're going to create a bunch of stuff, and especially if you want to use it across multiple sessions with different players. So that's something that you really probably don't realize until you start getting into the campaign. You're like, oh, wait, I want to make some new NPCs. Well, you can do that in your session if that's all it's for. But if you plan on taking it to the next level and using it in other areas, or you want the same type, if you put that much effort into it and you want to use it in other places, you want to have a separate game campaign so that you can build everything and export it out from there and then use it in other games. That's where a lot of us don't realize that till we've, several months in, we're like, hey, how do you, and then you sort of get stuck, and then you realize it's a lot of work to redo everything in a separate campaign. So it's better to start off fresh with a new campaign for creating content. And that would be per rule set. So if you play Pathfinder or one of the other, like D&D or whatever, you want to have a separate work folder for each rule set. So this is basically your launcher. I'm going to go ahead and create a new campaign. Now, one of the things that I had come across later, and I didn't realize this, is naming of campaigns. So for instance, I'm going to use D&D 5e. That's the one I'm most familiar with. So if I click that rule set, when I'm going to make a title for the campaign, I'm just going to go 5e _ my game _ play or something like that. So this would be my play campaign. If it was going to be my work campaign, then I would change that. Not only do that, when I just need one fix like Needle Dart, I'm likely to make a separate fix version. Yeah, exactly. Yep. Yeah, so the other thing is 5e my play. So this is my play session. So I would make the play session and then a work session. So that way they're separate, but they are of the same content. And then you got to choose how your friends or how you're going to host the game. So if you host on the cloud and public, when you go to join a game as a player, the GM's name and the session name will show up in the lobby. Yeah, I hear you. This would be basically hosted online for the connection and their credentials, not the files. So everything that Fantasy Grounds has is essentially hosted on your computer. The only difference here is that this is hosted through a brokering system, through a server, and it helps cut out the need to know IP addresses and port forwarding and having different connection types. This generally reduces the amount of confusion on that. This does not mean that Fantasy Grounds will not be blocked by one thing or another. I know that people use VPNs for privacy. Sometimes that can interfere. When you set up Fantasy Grounds for the first time, if you don't see the pop-up that allows the firewall, and this is for Macs, for PCs and stuff, it could block data, whether you're a player or a GM. And the other thing is antivirus. Sometimes it sees Fantasy Grounds as a threat or the activities. Basically, it's data going back and forth between players and the host. Those are all perceived as risks, so they'll tend to get blocked. And even your internet service provider, I know that Xfinity, Comcast use an advanced protection, and that's if you lease a modem through them, and it's basically a way to shield you from flooding your account, from DDoS attacks, that sort of thing. If that's enabled, that can also block Fantasy Grounds. So there are lots of ways that can be problematic. But when it comes to using the cloud, this is more universal. It's more plug and play. I'm not saying it's perfect, because sometimes VPNs don't work nicely with their cloud server, but it does not host any games. There are no, your backups are not there. There's no backup. It's just basically your password, probably your IP address, and your credentials. That's it. There's no files. Yeah, some have rational, which makes, yeah, exactly. And then if you're going to do a direct connect through LAN, which is your local area network, you're going to have to basically use port forwarding, which is a whole nother setup. And this is one reason that they went to the cloud, because there's some people who cannot connect if you're using an IP version 6, which is a different type of IP address. The port forwarding only supports IP4. So in some countries, they've kind of run out of IP addresses, and they have to assign them a different IP address of different type, and it's not always compatible with that. So that's another thing. Another thing that's changed with Unity is that it uses, I believe it uses UDP instead of the other IP or whatever. So if you're going to set up LAN, I think it uses a UDP protocol instead. So that's another change that's happened. And then you still have the same types of issues potentially with content being blocked. So that's another thing that can be an issue. But those are typical things that people stumble on. They'll have one player who can't connect. So generally speaking, there is a troubleshooting article on the Fantasy Grounds Atlassian that kind of goes through some of those scenarios, and it's not going to cover everyone's situation, but it's a good place to start. So password, since I'm not connected to anyone or anything, I don't need a password, but get in the habit of putting a password on your games if you're going to be hosting them either locally, at a library or something like that, or if you're going to be doing it online. That way you don't get random people joining your games. You can change the password while you're in a session, but it's better to just make a best practice. And then also, if players get a password, make sure they type it in. Sometimes when you copy and paste, it will copy extra characters or spaces that are not visible. And they go, well, I did put in the password. I said, did you type it or did you copy and paste it? And sometimes, oh yeah, I pasted it in there. So when they type it by hand, it helps eliminate the potential that there was a extra space in there or something goofy like that. And then, of course, the GM sometimes gives them the wrong thing, or it's case sensitive or whatever. So you got to kind of remember that. And I've had people, do that, and it can get frustrating. The other thing is, once you create a password and everyone's been connected, there is a history that comes up that they can connect to from that point on. Once you do it once and they've disconnected, and then maybe next week they come back, there'll be a history. However, I found that occasionally that history file can get corrupted. So you have to manually type it in occasionally if you're running into that issue, or if the GM changed the password and didn't say anything. But generally speaking, the history works well, but every once in a while, some little change or something happens. And I don't know if it's corruption or what, but I have had players try to use the history. I didn't change anything on my end, but something happens. Maybe it's on the server. I don't know. But nonetheless, have them type in the password before you freak out. Make sure that it's not, the old password hasn't expired or got corrupted. It only happens occasionally. So I'm on LAN, and if you're going to use a LAN connection, the port is 1802. So that's just the thing. And remember, it's UDP, not TCP, IP, or whatever for Fantasy Grounds Unity. The Classic uses the other way, but the Fantasy Grounds Unity uses UDP. Okay, so extensions. Generally speaking, I don't use them if I can help it. They are helpful. They are useful. There's some really cool stuff out there. But I think in the beginning, you kind of want to learn the vanilla parts of Fantasy Grounds so you know how to handle things if the extensions don't work. And the other thing is keeping up with updates and, risking that every week or every month, having that issue. So it's kind of up to you what you want to do with those. I don't want to discredit the people who make extensions. Some of them make a living off of it. So, I don't want to say, hey, don't ever use these extensions. I'm not like that. I use them occasionally too. So it's just a matter of sanity and a matter of risk. That's all it is. So in this case, I'm not going to use anything except for an official extension. You have this little all button up here under extensions where you can drop this down. I'm just going to go to theme because I want to change the theme. Now be careful with themes. Some of those third-party ones don't always get up to date. So they might look a little goofy or might be off a little bit. I try to stick with the more traditional or no theme at all. You don't have to have a theme. Most rule sets have a base theme. But if you want to add anything, you can. So I'm just going to add the D&D theme. This is an official one. I don't know if there's a way to differentiate between what's official and what isn't. But most cases, these are official and they've been tested and they're maintained by Fantasy Grounds or by Smiteworks. So right now I just have the D&D theme. I don't even really need that, but it just wanted to show you that this is where your extensions are. And when you load them, you got to kind of be careful to understand that some extensions kind of walk on top of each other. So if they have functionality that's shared or that's similar, like let's say they both impact the combat tracker, these are the times when those things kind of become incompatible, or maybe a new update has broke it or whatever. So just kind of be careful with those. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and hit start. Now, generally speaking, this load time, not much you can do about it. There are, I timed it once. I did a fresh copy of Fantasy Grounds with nothing added. And then I had my other account where it was just like 50 million things. And taking that stuff away only saved me a fraction of a second. It really didn't make that big of a difference. So when it comes to load time, there ain't a whole lot you can do with that. That has to do with your system, your connectivity, your library, all kinds of factors factor into this. So it isn't just content. There's other things involved, but there is no real way to speed that up. That is something that's going to remain. So generally speaking, this is a fresh campaign, nothing loaded other than some defaults. This campaign setup is kind of new. This is a few years old. This was not the thing a while back ago, but this gives you a direct link to the user guides and to the forum. So if you click on these and it says you want to allow this, you say yes to all, it's going to take you to a web page that's going to give you the user guides, depending on what rule set you're using, that sort of thing. And it just depends on your familiarity with the platform. If you need to go to the forums, you can also click on that and it will take you to a web page with the forums. So it just depends on the rule set and what your needs are. But that's a really quick way to get to those without having to look it up. The show on load. So if, for instance, this is your first time and you don't want this to come up next time you connect, you can click on that little dot and this won't pop up anymore. So I'm going to hit the next button. This is where you load your content. So if you own rules, like rule sets, You can load modules manually, or you can click on some of these presets. So I wouldn't click on all rules. That could be potentially like too much at once. But for instance, I'm going to load up the 2024 core rules. Or if you're not going to play the, the new rules or the old rules, you can pick between those. So in the settings, if you accidentally said, yeah, I want to use the 2024 core rules, and you didn't own any of that or you didn't want that, you can come into the settings and turn that off. So there is a setting on here which will allow you to turn off between legacy and the new 2024 rules. So here's the setting. I went ahead and allowed it because I'm going to basically use those rules. If you change it to 2024, you can use both. You can use 2024 and the older stuff. If you only put it on legacy, you won't get any of the 2024 content or functionality. So that's the difference there. So if you leave it on 2024, you can do both. If you just have it on legacy, then you want to just stick with all the older content. But that's something that's come up that's kind of new because the rule sets have been changing and such. So this is also something that might be in Pathfinder 2 between the, I guess, the orc license and some of the newer rebuilt content. So that might also be a thing where you'll have to decide at that point if you're going to use the newer stuff or legacy. So it depends on the rule set. Not all rule sets are going through this, but a lot of the major ones are. So that's something you'll have to juggle with. The other thing is I'm just going to load the core rules here. There are no official modules for this rule set yet, but this loaded the player's handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and such. So those are the core rules. They need to add the monster manual, I believe, because I don't see that on the list. So I'm going to go to the module activation. I'm going to search for monster manual. And here's the old legacy one, and then here's the new one. So I'm going to go ahead and hit load. So I think that needs to be added to the core rules load. I don't think they've done that yet. I might report that. It's not a big deal. And then if you wanted to, for instance, when you're inside the modules and you just want to see the things that you have loaded, there is a rule set filter for just the content for that rule set instead of everything. The load filter will show everything that's loaded in your campaign, and then the share filter will only show the modules that are shared with your players. So that's what these filters are for. Very handy. And you can search by title, and if you don't know the title, you can do it by publisher or author. So that's kind of a nice way to look for content, especially as your collection grows. So I have all the core rules loaded. I'm going to close this. I'm going to hit next. And this takes you to the options screen that I already had up earlier. So it creates kind of a circle. So when you first log into Fantasy Grounds, this pops up. You go through all those, and then it leads you to this. If for some reason you do want this to come back up, you can change this and just go to settings or setup, and it'll bring that back up. So if you accidentally close that and you want it to come back up again, in your options area, you can click setup and it'll bring it right back to the beginning. So it creates a loop, which isn't too bad. All right, so for setting up, this is where I think a lot of people get overwhelmed, especially when they're new to Fantasy Grounds. So, we talked about logging in and hosting a little bit and networking issues. We're talking about loading your content, your books. So that's some of the first steps. And now you're in the options area, which really depends on the rule set. So some rule sets support different things than others. If you have extensions, they may add new options or different options on here. So you got to be careful with that. But some of the basics is like, for instance, the active color would impact the type of lines. And if I draw shapes on a map, that will change that color. Like if you do the targeting shapes for area of effect. So instead of being black, I'll go ahead and change it to like a yellow color and hit OK. So this is to change the color if you're going to be drawing shapes on a map. The dice is something that's kind of new. Like the last year and a half or so, Fantasy Grounds has introduced these fancy dice. I think it's a good move, good marketing. And just so you know, if you're a player, you do have to buy your own dice. So even if you can see the GM's dice, if you want something other than the generic stuff, generic color, you'll have to buy your own. So that is one of the few expenses that a player will have to shoulder. You can also buy dice for your players or for your friends or your favorite GM. But if you come up here to the dice icon, it'll bring up a menu. And there are plenty of dice to choose from. They've added a couple new features. So this is the active color right now. And you can randomize the skin by clicking on randomize. That's kind of new. So it will just randomly select one of the choices that you own, or even go to this is more like a default. If you want to change to like the official Fantasy Grounds dice skin, that's this right here with their new branding. Or if you just want the throwback set, which is like the old set you get in a 2E box set, you can use that. Or you can just use this default one and you can color it yourself. What's kind of nice about this coloring is that you can use the eyedropper and you can theme the dice to the color of whatever this is. So in this case, maybe I want this red up here. So if I select the red from this area up here, I could use that. So, it just depends. So anything over here, like this is, you can mouse over and essentially pick whatever it is that you want. So maybe you want this red, but then when you have to hit OK to agree to it. And then for the text, let's say I want this gold. So again, I'll click on the color picker and just hover over whatever color you're looking for. So let's go with this gold. There you go. So you can use the gold or you can use whatever color you want. So that's just a way to customize your dice if you're into that sort of thing. And then of course, these are you got the main ones and the elemental basics. So I think your players can play around with those. So at the minimum, they can have those if they don't own any. And maybe these metal ones, I don't remember if those are paid or not. It's probably not because these are probably more premium. But you have metallic, you have these aura ones that have like these kind of cool auras when you pick the dice up and roll. You have all these, like here's the magical one or the ring of elements. So when you drag and drop these and drop them into the dice, it has these fancy animations. You can also turn off the animations, I believe, or there's versions of them that don't have animations. So that could be something that you have to look at. Some of them are recolorable. So when you have this little color palette, that means that you can change the colors. So if you wanted to make them yellow or blue or whatever, you can do that. There's some really fancy ones down here at the bottom. These are individual. You have these stars and clovers. There's a skull, this toxic burst one. So when you roll, you get these little skull thingies. You have dragon dice that are based off of different dragons, and they got this little motif like scales, claws, wings, that sort of thing. And then you have monster dice that are based off of different monster types. And those are expanding as we speak. So I think they're constantly going to be making these. And eventually, there's going to be so many dice. I don't think this might even become unwieldy. But here's like some werewolf dice. Let's see, what do they call that? Moon Howl with effects. So when you do that, you roll, you get these claws, like kind of like a werewolf type thing. And what's really neat is you can assign dice to specific NPCs, or you can also assign specific damage types. So depending on your rule set, like what type of damage, you can assign specific dice for damage types and specific dice for creature types, which is kind of cool. And then the universal one is just for your players or for, just for your generic stuff. So that's the dice, kind of cool. I like the dice. They're going in the right direction with it. I did like the randomized thing because sometimes I don't know, and it picked a random set and a random color. So sometimes you'll find some really cool options here. So this one, I don't know what this is, but it looks cool. I like the graphics. It looks kind of techy or steampunk-like. So anyways, So that's your dice. If, like I said, that's individual per account. So GM players, they have to buy their own essentially. Okay, so this is the theme that I loaded. This is the official new D&D theme. Like I said, you don't have to have this. If you pick no theme at all, generally speaking, Fantasy Grounds will just load what was made for that rule set. That's generally a lot safer, a lot less graphic heavy in most cases. You won't necessarily have a decal like this. You'll have like probably the official Smiteworks logo. You can change that background decal. So if you go to your options and you come up to background decal, you can change these. There's some that come with the art subscription where you'll have more options, some that come with rule books, and then some that were designed for a specific extension or something. In most cases, I usually don't want a decal back here, so you can use empty. That clears. There's nothing there. However, there are cases where you might want it for, especially like newer tables, newer players. You could make your own, and then you can assign it here. And what I would like to see in some cases is basic rules here. So instead of having a fancy picture, maybe you're going to put a cheat sheet there so that your players can read it and they'll have access to it, and it's right on the desktop. So it might be a picture of the rules, like a basic flow chart of how combat works, or some kind of instruction. So it doesn't always have to be a fancy picture. I mean, you could do something like that, but in a lot of cases, either I usually don't have one at all, or I'll have a little piece of the rules here, so the players can look at that when they're learning how to use Fantasy Grounds and learning the rule set. It's handy to have a graphic here that shows some basics, like the rules, some really base rules, not anything too crazy. But like I said, you can use an empty decal and not have anything at all. Trying to think of some other setup things. The other thing I always bring up in my videos that I think is very important in Fantasy Grounds is the windows. Windows management in Fantasy Grounds can get very, very frustrating. One of the things you'll have to learn over time is that once you open a window, it's usually going to be in the very center to start with. So in other words, if I go to campaign and I open encounters, it's always going to open up in the middle. So knowing that and assuming that, you're going to be able to move those wherever you want them to appear. So if I always want this to show up here on the left, if I leave it like that and I close it, when I go to click on it again, that's where it's going to be next time. So once you understand that, that really helps with Windows management. It doesn't necessarily fix the lack of room, but it gives you an idea of where these things are going to be popping up when you click on them. Now, it's very important to understand that, because I don't know how many times I've opened up a window for the first time and it's smack dab in the middle, right, covering everything. So once you understand that, if you start moving your windows and resizing the window to whatever size you need it, that really helps a lot. That really cuts down that frustration over time. It is kind of a workaround. It's one of those things, since you can't pop windows up and out of Fantasy Grounds, this is probably your best bet in managing the windows. So I want to talk a little bit about the data and how it's connected. So encounters essentially are made up of NPCs, or they may be called something different in your rule set, but essentially encounters are made up of NPCs. So under encounter, you go to NPCs, those make up encounters. So for story entries, that used to be the standard for creating content. You'd have a story entry, but now they're going to books. So if you go to library under books, that's kind of what's been replacing or supplementing the story entries, but they're kind of related. So books are traditionally made up of a bunch of story pieces, but this is the older way, using the books or the story entries, and then you would make it up from there and connect them. but now everything can be done in either one or the other or both. So those are kind of related. And then you have, let's see, that's stories. So also there are quest items, which aren't really stories, but they are more narrative, story-driven ways to award experience points. So that's goals, milestones, rescue the princess, that sort of thing. So you can make up little story entries here. I guess they're called quest items, and it might be called something else in a different rule set. But essentially, those are ways to award your players for milestones or for completing an objective, that sort of thing. So then there are images, and that's basically your maps, handouts, those sort of things. And then you have your items. So items are kind of a separate thing, and those are individual items made up depending if they're armor, weapons, gear, and then you have a template and then a forge where you can combine things. The parcels are basically what items make. So when you make up a bunch of items, you can put them in a parcel, and those are basically like a collection of treasure or a treasure chest of stuff, whatever you need it to be. But those are related. So when you're building content, you would start with NPCs, and then you would build your encounters after that. If you want to build treasure or loot, you would build the individual items first, and then make a parcel, which is one or more item, basically. And then your books, story, quests, images, those are more based on the storytelling and the visual aspect of for your text and pictures and stuff. That's kind of what this is all about. And then you have tables, which is for randomization. And then let's see, what else do we got here? Vehicles are kind of like NPCs, so I would put that in that category. So vehicles are essentially NPCs in most cases. Let's see, so you got tables, parcels, NPCs. Yes, that's basically how those data is related. And then you have locations now, which is a newer thing, which can give you a way to connect locations with different aspects of the rule set, meaning let's say you have a continent and there are several states inside of it, and you can kind of drill down like that by location. So this is kind of a world building or world management tool now. It was built for the newer 2024 Bastions, but in a lot of the core rules, this is a thing. So you can kind of connect locations together using this. So that's kind of cool. It's in a step in the right direction for campaign management when it comes to locations. If you've been around for a while, I think Deluxe Oz had something like that, and then there was also the player agency extension, which kind of expands on this a little more. But this is basically the vanilla version, and it wasn't necessarily designed for all the rules, but it can be used in rules to connect things together, meaning locations. You can drill down from planet to continent to city to dungeon. You can kind of go down like that. And then you would connect them all together. So you'd make you'd make the stats for it if applicable, and put your description in here, and then you have GM notes. So you can have notes for the game master, and then you can have these descriptions for players to read, and what you can share these with your players depending on what it is. So that's kind of a cool way for for managing your campaign, I guess, or kind of like world building essentially. So that's kind of new. Let's see. So quests, location, stories. That's pretty much the campaign stuff, right? Those are the things that make up adventures, modules, accessories, bestiaries, that sort of thing. So this is the content that is what Fantasy Grounds mostly is. The other half of it, when I say the other half, is player facing stuff. So this has to do with character creation. So once you're done, or you're never done, I guess, is once you've got a kind of a handle on most of the interface, my next suggestion or best practice is to get to know character creation. So I'm going to collapse the things I'm not using right now and click on character. Now these are all the things that build up a character. So you have backgrounds, You have classes or archetypes or whatever they're called in your rule set. You have feats in some cases, skills, and like I said, this will vary depending on rule set. So they kind of probably mean the same thing, but there might be titled differently. So species, which is basically race, and then spells. So these are all the things that make up character creation. These can be customized. You can make your own, but just keep in mind that a lot of the character wizards that are out there that help you build characters rely on official content mostly. So it doesn't mean you can't use homebrew with a character creation tool such as a character wizard, but they are keyed or parsed with official content, meaning that it won't always pick up homebrew stuff. So my advice for character creation, for custom content or third party even, is to do drag and drop, which is manually dragging over the elements of the player. If you're going to use the standard rules with the official content, you can get away with using the character wizard easier, and it will pick up most of that. If you're going to use a lot of third-party homebrew stuff, things that you made, I would use drag and drop. You can have a little less heartache there, depending on what you're going to do. But learning how to build characters, I believe, is probably your paramount, because that impacts the gameplay, the flow of the game, what the player's characters can do, and the things that pop up that you're not aware of for every single instance of the characters. So there are lots of different combinations and builds and options out there. And if you're unfamiliar with character creation, it's much harder to help your players. You don't need to memorize everything, but you just need to know how to fix, how to work on it, how to level up, how to adjust, customize, all those things are going to come up. You don't have to know it all at once. You just do it over time. It does take a bit to wrap your mind around it. But if you're new to the rule set, let's say you're new to D&D, you're new to Fantasy Grounds, it can be very overwhelming, because not only are you trying to learn the rules, but you're trying to also learn how the interfaces with the rules that it supports. So there's kind of like where the rubber meets the road. So that's probably the biggest hurdle or the biggest time suck there, is to have that sort of familiarity. And that really boils down to a couple things. One is playing around with the rule set and with Fantasy Grounds and using the platform. That's what it takes. There is no easy button. You do have to put a little bit of time in to get familiar with the way things work. It's not something that's easily taught. It's not something that a video is going to always cover. You have to use the rule set, and you're going to adapt whatever way you need to run your games. There is no one size fits all, because the rule sets are all different. They are all slightly different in how they're implemented, and what type of automation, what type of content, and what type of version that's supported is all going to kind of be different between rule sets. There are some core functionalities like I'm showing you now, but there are some nuances that only pertain to certain rule sets. And it'll get kind of frustrating at times if you come across a video for 5e, but you're playing Starfinder or something. It's not going to necessarily answer your rules questions. Maybe it will help you understand how the platform works, but it's not necessarily going to make you understand how to handle a certain situation with a certain rule set for a certain occasion. So those sort of things come up over time. There's really no way to do that other than to do it. I mean, to actually use the rule set and to get familiar with Fantasy Grounds. So that's really the bottom line there, is using the platform. If you don't use it, you're not going to understand it. And that's the bottom line. A lot of people don't have the time for it. So my suggestion is to play with it. That's basically with a really big takeaway. And I think learning the functionality of these windows, because I told you earlier that if you move the windows where you want them to go, next time you pop them up, it should go where you left it. So if I bring this up, all these things should show up where I left them. And that's important to know that. The new setting in Fantasy Grounds by default is restore windows on start. That used to be off, but now they switched it to on. So when you come back, if you leave all your windows open and you come back to Fantasy Grounds, they're all going to be where you left them, which is really handy. That wasn't a thing before. And there was an extension called Windows Saver X, which kind of did the same thing, but it's been rolled into Fantasy Grounds. So once you understand how this works and how this can help you instead of fighting with it, it gets a little bit easier. I'm not saying it's easier to run a game or to make a character, but it's easier to understanding what is going on with Fantasy Grounds in regards to the interface. So generally speaking, when I start off, I always have some sort of method or some sort of best practice for myself that I use for setting up. So for instance, like this window here, this is one of the few windows that you can lock. This is the chat window. So if I unlock this and I left click and drag this, I can make this any size I want. Generally speaking, I'll make it a little wider. And I used to, put it down here and make it shorter. You don't necessarily have to do that. But I'll do that just so I can read a little bit better and I get a little bit more width. But if you don't want to, you don't have to. But once you have it in position, if you right click on it again and click on the lock, it won't move anymore, which is nice. The next thing I'll do is a combat tracker thing. So that's, again, it's going to pop up in the center. So if you move this over and place it like accordingly, like to the way you want, it'll stay there. And generally speaking, this is, have all this room here for NPCs and players. And then down here would be where the text is for whatever the outcome, the roles, that sort of thing. So all your roles here are in this chat window and it will record those. Or sometimes it'll do turn order effects depending on what's going on in your game. The next thing I'll do is I'll bring up the party sheet, which is essentially how you track all your players. So these are the main pieces of Fantasy Grounds when it comes to running a game and such, and managing your sessions. So Combat Tracker does a lot of things. It tracks initiative, it tracks hit points, it tracks effects, it'll track concentration, death saves, depending on the rule set, and whatnot. So these are a lot of functionality. I think honestly, the Combat Tracker is probably your most powerful tool. The chat window will display, sometimes depending on the settings, what the outcome of the roll was, or whose turn it is, or if you successfully strike an opponent or you make a save. Those sort of things can be conveyed here, but they can also be changed in the settings, like what information is outputted. The other thing you can use is a dice tower. If you like suspense or you like to tell story and you don't want to necessarily always have the rolls showing, you can opt to turn on the dice tower. So the dice tower is kind of an optional thing depending on the rule set, but if you click it on, it'll always appear on the bottom right corner, which I don't understand why. I kind of wish it would be over here, but anyways, right click on it, unlock it, move it to where you want it to go. Typically, I'll put it next to the dice. Once I have it located, I'll go ahead and lock it. So it's one of the few things that you can lock is the chat window, the dice tower, and this dice tray. Everything else is kind of free floating. So I'll use that dice tower for telling a story. So for instance, if I ask someone to roll for sneak, for stealth, I might have them roll a 20-sided and drop it in the tower. And let's say it's with advantage. And I won't necessarily say what the number needs to be. I'm just say, hey, there's a guard on the tower. He's looking around. You guys are going to have to find a way to either get in a different way or sneak past this guard. So typically guards, I believe most guards in 5e have a 12 passive perception. So this individual has to roll above a 12. So I would just have them roll their stealth roll and click on advantage. Maybe there's a distraction being made, and we'll go ahead and roll in the dice tower. So in this case, only the GM would see the result. In this case, it was a really bad roll. It dropped the 3, but kept the 5. But then you might have had a bonus, like in a lot of cases, rogues and such will have a stealth bonus. So maybe it was +7. So maybe it is a 12. So that might be a thing, and then you could narrate how that came about. If you just roll openly, it changes the way people play, right? So if they see that at 10, they're 50-50 chance that they're going to be spotted. They'll change the way they play. So you can use a dice tower as a way to kind of make the rolls less meta. You know, like you're not going to have as much metagaming, and have a little bit more control over the narrative, or at least be able to fudge roll. So sometimes I'll just randomly roll a d20 in here, and the players will know that I rolled a dice, but they won't know what it's for. Or I might roll a percentage. Maybe there's a table you roll on there, and that would give you the percentile number or the value. I just do it randomly. Sometimes I throw them off. So they're like, oh, what's he rolling for? And you're just rolling for no reason, just to throw them off, just to upset them. So that's just a tool. So you don't have to use a dice tower. Some rule sets don't even use it. I like it for 50-50, or, you know, for storytelling, or for making things more suspenseful, that sort of thing, and to cut off metagaming. Party sheet is another good tool. This allows you to manage the entire party. It does not support NPCs, animals, that sort of thing, unless they are in character format. So if you want to track experience points for sidekicks and for that sort of thing, if it's player owned and it's on the combat tracker, you can put it on the party sheet. It'll track that. However, if you don't want experience points, treasure, that sort of thing being awarded to non-party members, so in other words, all those extraneous things, then you would only have the players on here, and that would be what you would use to award inventory, loot, coins. This is how you manage what order and formation they're in. And then your experience would also award your experience points for encounters, you know, for NPCs and for challenges, for quests or milestones. So this is where you manage all that stuff. And that's why you would build parcels, because those essentially award the quest or the treasure in the loot area and the inventory. And then your quest items and your encounters are the others. So if you have these two made up, you award the encounters here on the XP tab, or your quest items here. So this is an easier way to collect these things and drop them in here, and it will automatically list them here. And then when it's time, you can click award, and it will divide those up evenly amongst the party members. So remember that this main tab is only for characters. It's not going to allow you to drag NPCs over here unless you make them as a character, and then it's character or player owned or GM owned. So that's the only way you can do that. So it might vary a little bit between rule sets, but most rule sets have the chat window, the combat tracker, and the party sheet, and dice tower option. That's pretty standard amongst all the different rule sets. How they're implemented, what they track, and what they're called are going to be different. So it kind of depends on that. So as far as content goes, honestly, if you just stick with some basics, maybe the first 6 months or whatever, first 3 months, until you get the idea of where things are at, how to make characters, that sort of thing, it'll go a lot easier. If you try to do like sound and extensions and all that stuff right off the get-go, there's going to be a lot of confusion, a lot of questions. There might be some errors. So just kind of take it with a grain of salt. If you're going to add that much complexity in the beginning, it may be a little overwhelming. Some people get it, they can do it, but I think most of us would struggle with that. Let's see. So the other thing is, you know, you can share images with your players, build characters, keep track of your campaign stuff like your locations, the treasure, the NPCs, the loot. You can make a store if you wanted to. I'm not going to go into a tutorial about that, but there are extensions for that, which kind of helps automate buying, selling, and trading instead of doing it manually. But you can perform a lot of that through the party sheet. So if your players want to trade with one another, instead of dragging it back and forth between character sheets, which only the GM can do, you can do that through the party sheet generally. And all they'd have to do is drag their items. And if you share this tab or this sheet with your group, there's an option in the Fantasy Grounds options, which basically gives you party sheet player. So if you have that shared, if you have that on, it'll share this order tab. If you have the party sheet player show inventory details, then it will show this inventory. And in that case, your players can open that up, drag their inventory items up to this area, and it's kind of up for grabs, and then someone else can take it. It also creates a record. So if you wanted to do like buying, selling, and trading amongst the group, let's say they're camping for the, in between adventures, you can bring your table up, leave it open, and your players can log in and they could transfer the items they want to sell or trade in this area. And then when another person comes on, they can drag it from here to their inventory, and it will keep a record of the transactions, and then anything left over, you'll be able to sell it. So that's kind of a way to do buying and selling and trading within the group. But if you are going to a store, that sort of thing, you'll have to come up with your own way or use an extension. I think that I wish it was more of a storefront thing built into Fantasy Grounds, but it would be so different in every rule set that I don't know if a core functionality could work or not. I don't know, but I do like Matacure's extension for stores. That's pretty handy because you have pricing and you have percentage, you have markup, that sort of thing. So there are lots of different options in the options menu. I'm not going to go through all those, go through combat and all that. Just kind of wanted to do some best practices, kind of getting started, and kind of giving you a realistic view of some of the things that you want to work on first. So learn how to manage your windows, bake characters, understand that you don't need 100 books to run the game. Generally speaking, in my books area under library, that's what I have. I have the players or the Dungeon Master's Guide, the Monster Manual, and the Player's Handbook. The minimum here is the Player's Handbook. The other two books are nice to have, but I don't have to have those. And then the other stuff you might have is one other character creation book for your players, like for more options. But generally speaking, you don't need to load every single book that you own unless you're going to be creating content. And in that case, you don't want a bunch of people connected anyways. So there's some trade-off there between performance and what you need, and then stuff that you don't need. And you'll know that, or you'll learn that as time goes on. But this is kind of a best practice, is you don't need to load every single book. Once you're done with character creation, you can disable a lot of those after 3rd level because they don't normally need anything other than class features afterwards. I think the species or something like that, sometimes those level up now, or the backgrounds. I don't remember in the 2024 rule set. But generally speaking, if you're going to have mostly just the player's handbook and then maybe a couple other books loaded in case they want new spells or new species or new backgrounds and all that sort of thing. But once they build their character, they generally don't need all those books. And you could get away with the main rule book, the player's handbook, and whatever module or campaign you're running. If you're doing a lot of homebrew, you're going to have to do a lot of prep or a little bit more prep. You can do it as you go. You don't have to build everything at once, but you'll have to have a few more books open, I think. So generally speaking, I think that's about all I'm going to cover right now. And if you want more stuff like this, tomorrow, March 2nd, Sunday at 1 p.m. noon Pacific time, I'm going to be running a kind of like more of an in-person type thing. So if you guys are interested in that, follow our YouTube channel if you want, or you can go to our Discord. I have an event here. I've got like 5 people signed up, and this will show in your local time zone. So I got some newer folks here, people that haven't played in a while. And what I'm going to do is just kind of go through this type of stuff live in Discord, and I'll do a screen share. We're not going to stream it. It'll just be a small group of people if they show up. So that's our Fantasy Grounds Academy Discord. You can find that on our webpage. We've got all that stuff. So kind of signing off now, kind of giving you some other tips. And if you can't make tomorrow, we do offer a class request. So you can put, you can decide, how you want to what time you're available. You want to put your time zone, what rule set, what type of thing you need help with, and we'll try to get someone to help you with it. But we are an all volunteer community. We are not part of SmiteWorks. We don't, we're not owned by them. I do work with them now. I talk to Doug at least once a month through email and ask him things. But generally speaking, we're autonomous. We have our own kind of thing going on. We try to work with SmiteWorks, of course. They're the ones who make the software. But as far as learning this stuff, you really do. Initially, it's nice to have someone to help you onboard and to help you kind of get used to the ropes. Once you get used to it, you can probably do a lot of it on your own. And I make a ton of videos. So if you're watching me on YouTube, I have a ton of archived videos also on Twitch and X now and YouTube, I believe. So, if you guys want more stuff or specific things, I've covered a lot of different things, like making characters, building NPCs, putting line of sight on maps, all that kind of stuff. So I do those repetitively, like every year I'll do a couple of each, because you get a new group of people every so often, like after a big sale, like after a big Fantasy Ground sale or whatever. So that's generally what we're about. It's kind of more or less free help for people who want more in-depth information. Not for everybody. Not everyone likes that type of instruction. So if you're not that type, you can figure it out on your own. You don't necessarily need Fantasy Grounds Academy, but just know that we're not trying to be know-it-alls. We don't know everything. We just know from the user standpoint and from experience best practices. So this is our 8th year. So this summer will be 8 years doing this. So I think we got a little bit of information. And we're also evolving with the platform. So we're not just stagnant. We just follow this certain thing. I mean, we have to kind of evolve with the changes that are going on in the background and in the community too. So anyhow, you guys take care. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. And I think we got St. Patrick's Day. Maybe I'll run a St. Patrick's Day one shot. We'll see if I have time. I started a new job, so I don't have a lot of time anymore, but I'm trying to do at least one video a week. I was doing a lot, but when I wasn't working, and thanks to those who supported me during that time. And if you feel inclined and you like what we do have our own, we have a donation thing. So in our Discord, or if you want to look for Fantasy Grounds Academy, basically Patreon, we have that too. But we do have, let's see, here's a donation thing. So you don't necessarily have to give us money, but we have referral links, and we also have affiliates on the DMs Guild. We have Sirenscape affiliate. We have just our affiliate from going to the Fantasy Grounds store. It helps us a little bit. And then, of course, we have all this stuff too, like donations, wish list, and all that stuff. So if you guys want to help out, you can do it that way too. You don't have to. It's strictly volunteer. Anyhow, folks, hopefully that helps a little bit. I don't know if you guys like this kind of content or not. Anyways, I think I rambled enough. That's been a good solid hour. So you guys take care, and I'll see you back next time. And if you missed a lot of this, you can always go back and watch the archive. I'm going to go update it and make sure it's right and everything.